This is TWiT.
Let's kick things off. I have to say, I was very excited this morning. I woke up and I looked at my phone, and there were two things I was looking for. One was a notification from my doctor for the results of my COVID test to make sure that I didn't have it. And I was negative for COVID and the two variants of flu that they're testing for now. So yay, that was exciting. But one I wasn't expecting, but that I did get, was a notification from FedEx saying that a package from Apple was on its way. A package I wasn't expecting to get until mid-August is now coming this coming Tuesday, not today, but this next Tuesday. And that is an M2 MacBook Air that I thought I was going to have to wait a lot longer for. But some folks, Jason Snell included, have an early look at the MacBook Air and have done a review. So tell us, Jason, what your thoughts are on the new M2 MacBook Air.
Mikah, is this your card?
Oh my God, how did you guess?
I guessed it was the M2 MacBook Air. It's here for some people, mostly base configurations. But yeah, it sounds like they're starting to ship to everybody else. I got mine a couple of weeks ago. Couldn't talk about it last week. Was not allowed. Had to pretend I didn't have it. But it's here now. I've been a big fan of the MacBook Air since the early days. I actually had that first MacBook Air that was terrible, but I loved it because it was so small. And then fortunately, they got rid of that and replaced it with the one that we all know and love in 2010. And it's been Apple's most popular laptop for basically the last decade. And this is a big redesign in the sense that it's really based on that design language from the 14 and 16-inch MacBook Pros that were introduced last year. So they've got the wedge shape is out, the little kind of curvy edges are out. And instead, you've got this sort of flat kind of like the curves right on the edges, but otherwise perfectly flat. It's got MagSafe. It's got two USB-C ports and an M2 processor that we already know because it's the same one that was in that MacBook Pro that was released last month. And yeah, it's a new era for the MacBook Air. And I just want to point out something, which is that I gave the headline a new era and spelled it out. I noticed that The Verge's story about it was also headlined a new era, but they decided to say AIR-A because they didn't trust their readers to get it.
No.
I trust my readers to get it.
Thank you for not having contempt for your readers. So I have to say, I was kind of surprised. So I got the midnight version, and I got the one with 8-core CPU, 10-core GPU, 16 gigs of RAM, and a terabyte of storage. So I thought, I'm going to have to wait, and that's fine. So I was shook and shocked when I saw that it's supposed to be coming this next week. I know that lots of base configuration models were shipping on time or arriving on time, but have any of you seen any other folks talking about how theirs that was originally pushed further out are coming sooner? Or was this just kind of a fluke for me?
I've heard that the 16 with terabyte is actually like a secret. They seem to have built a bunch of those because I've heard a bunch of those being in stock in Apple stores too. And that's a tip for those of you who really are desperate to get your hand on this laptop or maybe some other Apple product when it comes out. They reserve an amount of them and put them in stores that are not available. So you might think, well, it's back ordered for a month, so I'm not going to be able to get my hands on it. I placed that online order and now I wait. Well, you can cancel that online order if you need to, because you should check with your local store or maybe go to your local store. They often have stock. And one of the things I've heard is that 1 terabyte storage model with the 16 gigs of RAM is also something that has been cropping up in Apple stores.
That is a good tip. That's a really good tip. So
yeah, I
tell
picked
us
up
about...
a couple.
I've
definitely picked up a couple of things first thing in the morning, and also like you just get there right as it opens, and you, oftentimes they have 3-4 of them of many things that are oftentimes sold out. They kind of seed those out. It's also useful to be I've learned over time that back when we were buying lots and lots of computers, that being a business user is useful. You should do it if you have a business. Sign up, build a relationship.
Yeah, because they have a business rep at the Apple Store, and they will talk to you, and they will reserve things for you and help you.
Exactly. They'll be like, hey,
it's quite nice.
Tomorrow would be great if you came in. It'd be great to visit. here tomorrow.
I've got a bag with from when I got my last MacBook Pro. Well, when TWiT got the last MacBook Pro, there's still a bag that I have that has my name on like a label on the side. Whenever I walked in, they were like, "Oh, not only did they help me out, but they were also like, we had your shows on today," which was just a really kind of fun thing. But I'm curious, how do you approach, Jason, or how did you approach the review for this specific MacBook Air? And was it for you a comparison to that MacBook Pro that people seem to be kind of confused about that just came out? Or were you really looking at it as an iteration on the MacBook Air itself? Or did you answer some of those questions like, should I get this or should I get the MacBook Pro?
I think the most important context is to compare it to the MacBook Airs of old, not only the M1, which is sort of the last of that other era, but also of Intel MacBook Airs, because the truth is most people updating to this computer are not coming from an M1 Air. They're coming from an Intel MacBook Air probably. And so I tried to think about that. I got this. I was actually on vacation when this came in, which was weird because Apple is very secretive about sending you review units. And I had to be like, you need to send this to a condo that is a Verbo in San Diego. And I've never been there before, but here's the address and it should work. And it all worked fine. But I ended up with two MacBook Airs. I ended up with my MacBook Air and this MacBook Air. And so it was kind of great because I was on vacation. And so I had a laptop in the condo and I was checking email and writing stuff. And I was doing, whatever, like not working because I was on vacation. But I got to travel with it, which I thought was actually, that's good, right? Like that's a part of the point of doing a laptop. And then in my approach, the truth is what we learned about the M1 is true of the M2, which is these chips are what they are. And you can put them in different wrappers, and the performance, if you do benchmark testing, is largely identical because, an M1 Air and an M1 Mini and an M1 13-inch MacBook Pro and an M1 iMac, they're all the same. They all get the same scores, more or less. So I tried to focus on the MacBook Air experience and also think a little bit about coming from Intel. My wife has a 2018 Intel MacBook Air she probably won't have very much longer, and it is startling how much you forget if you've been living on an M1 MacBook Air for a while, how slow in comparison those Intel MacBook Airs were. And that's just a function of the Apple Silicon transition more than anything else. And yeah, the M2 is faster than M1. There's no doubt about it. And the design is really nice. And having MagSafe come back, and not just because it's MagSafe and all the benefits of that, but having that extra port now. My M1 Air has that little dealie that you stick into the USB-C port that gives it fake MagSafe. And that's great, but that means I have one port. So having two usable ports is also a big part of this. But yeah, in the end, for me, it was mostly about what's the MacBook Air experience like, because I think that not only is it the most popular laptop, but that's the context most people are considering when they're buying this thing or thinking about buying it.
Absolutely. And that's kind of been one of the ongoing questions. I know Leo has talked a lot about how the sort of single core performance of all of the M1 series devices is very similar. The single core performance of these ones are likely to be very similar, and it's only in multi-core performance things. And so when you look at like the MacBook Air, which is this device that in theory is meant for browsing the web and doing some writing tasks and that kind of thing, then we don't necessarily look at that performance boost as part of it, which I think is part of the reason why, it doesn't have that active cooling system, right? But at the same time, I've seen folks talk about how they, threw a bunch of tasks at it, opened up a bunch of tabs, tried to do these little things. They couldn't get it to slow down. And it's fascinating to me what Apple Silicon has done in terms of changing the way that folks are kind of looking at these devices and trying to turn them into these productivity machines to an extra extent. I'm so confused, or not confused, but rather I'm so fascinated by how now they get a MacBook Air and they're trying to push it as hard as they can, even though this device maybe in years before was not meant that way. I mean, do we feel like that is because of the performance gains we've got from Apple Silicon itself, or is it just something that maybe I hadn't noticed before?
I mean, Andy can back me up on this. It's the bar being raised over time, right? Like it used to be like, oh, well, word processing. But as computers have advanced and in the power of Apple Silicon, that bar keeps getting raised. So now as a reviewer, I look at it and I say, you might not want to do 8K renders on this for an hour because it'll slow down. It'll still do it. It'll just be a little bit slower. And it's like 8K renders, right? Like the bar has been raised a lot over time. And the truth is 99.9% of people who buy the MacBook Air will never get it to throttle even. It will maybe get a little warm, maybe, and that's about it.
I think that our expectations grow. It's like a bag, our expectations will grow with no matter how fast you make the processor. We're going to go, well, it's pretty good. Like it could have done this better. It could have rendered 8K, or I could have been able to render, whatever those things are. But I will say that it's just incredible. Like these all the M1s. I mean, I'm not traveling as much, so I have a lot of the M1 minis. And I'm still taken aback by how fast they are, and that they just jumped so much forward. And then obviously the studio has been great as well. We've done some pretty extensive tests with the studio with video, and you just keep on adding more outputs, and you're like, it's going to slow down eventually.
Yeah, maybe that just points out what I agree absolutely with Jason's saying. I mean, when you're reviewing these things, it's hard to come up with a real world scenario in which you can say, "Oh, geez, that's too bad," because even stacked up next to like mid-range, big like 8-fan helicopter cooling style Windows laptops, this thing is just thrashing in the benchmarks and another hands-on actual test. But the thing is, like when the Apple's only Apple's problem is that they don't charge. They're not really good at giving you a really, really great deal. Like if this were an $800 laptop, we could possibly be reviewing things in sense of, well, but you know what? What are you going to get? Let's not expect too much because this is an $800 laptop. These are great benchmarks. It is appropriate to see, well, let's see what it takes to really make these things suffer and scream. Because look, a lot of these people are spending $1,500, $2,000, $3,000 on a MacBook Air. And for that amount of money, even at the lower end, they have a right to expect like the best possible upgrade they could possibly get over whatever they were using before.
I think that's a great point, too. The idea that we could be cynical about the fact that this is $11.99 and that the last year's model, essentially the M1 Air, is still on the price list at $9.99. But I think the other way to view it, and Andy, you were kind of getting at it there, too, is that M1 MacBook Air is great, right? And like, although I wish that this M2 Air was $9.99, it's not for various reasons. I think they are going to need to get it there eventually. But I'm so glad that $9.99 price point is still there. And the fact is, Apple Silicon was such a leap that even if you end up, I think that it's a legitimate buy, a good buy to buy the M1 MacBook Air even today, if you are looking at the prices and going, oh, it's a little too rich for my blood, because at $9.99, that M1 Air is still going to do 99.9% of the jobs that you ever wanted as fast as you could possibly want them.
Yeah, another response with a lot of nines in it. I think that it's really, really important that Apple hold that line and make sure there's always a MacBook available for less than $1,000, even if it's $1 less, because that also means that education prices is probably going to be $100 less. And there's so many people for whom that $100 or that $200 difference between the M1 and the M2 is going to be the difference between having a Mac and having a Windows machine. And most of those people would probably rather have a Mac, wouldn't they?
What is it outside of the processor? Sorry, what is it outside of the processor that brings this over that $9.99 price bump? What else did they do with the M2 over the M1 to really raise that price, do we think?
I think it's not the processor so much as it is the display is new. The webcam is upgraded. It's that notch display, it's not as good a display as this MacBook Pros that cost $2,000, but it's brighter and it's taller. And it's got the notch, but Apple's been very clever about hiding the menu bar and the notch. And I think that for most people, the menu bar being up there, it isn't that disruptive, and you get used to it, and it's fine. But it's a better display, it's a better webcam, it's a 1080 webcam. You've got MagSafe. This new design probably is a little more expensive than the old design too, in terms of the physical enclosure of it. I'm sure it's one of those things where they looked at the cost of making this right now and weren't comfortable taking it to $9.99 and thought, like I just said, that the M1 Air is actually pretty great. So why don't we keep selling it? But I do think that over time they need to push it down because, like Andy said, and it's the truth of it. It's the reality of it. There's a reason Apple tried to get rid of the MacBook Air a few years ago and replace it with the MacBook and the 13-inch MacBook Pro, both of which were $1199 or $1299, and they were Retina, and the MacBook Air wasn't, and people didn't care. They just kept buying the $999 laptop, and I think Apple's learned that lesson that for a lot of people, the $999 laptop is what they're going to buy. And that's it. Like you can try to sell me an $1199 laptop, but there's a certain portion of the consumer base that's just going to say no. So, that's why I think in the long run the M2 Air will need to get down there. And I know there's inflation and stuff like that, but like having that $999 price point, a lot of nines, like Andy said, I think is important. And I really wonder what they'll never say, but what the sales proportion will be between the M1 and the M2 over the next year, because I think they're still going to sell a lot of M1 Airs, and they should. It's a great computer.
I will say that Apple is starting to, it feels like there's a trajectory that looks a lot like the early 90s, where there are so many different chips and so many different computers that are being released, and they're all in different cadences that even for someone like me, I start going, I don't know what I want to buy. I think it was clear for a while, and I think it's starting to get murky. And I think that it's not murky yet, but I think that Apple has to start thinking about, the streamlining that a little bit. It probably has to do with supply chains and lots of other things of putting out what you can when you can, but with lots of different chipsets that are not as far apart, with lots of different outlays. It starts to get confusing. And it was not that didn't need to be, I don't know, 6 versions of the Mac when they're almost identical in the early 90s. But I start feeling a little deja vu that we're starting to get a lot of different pieces of hardware at different levels of development, and it's starting to lead to, I think people I've talked to are starting to get like they're just hanging on and not buying anything right now because they're not sure what the next thing is for them, because there's just so many different options and there's so fine a detail between them that it really takes a lot of thought, and something that Apple's been good at not forcing us to do for a long time, but it seems to be getting harder.